Welcome to our second lecture on Henry VII. In the last lecture we examined why Henry had a very tenuous claim to the English throne through the Lancastrian line and why there were so many Yorkist claimants alive and willing to challenge that claim. In this lecture we will study the first two critical years of Henry's reign and the steps he took to consolidate or secure his position as the legitimate King of England. We will first examine the steps that Henry took immediately following the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485. We will then examine how he used Parliament during the first 2 years of his reign to boost his legitimacy as king and to limit the power of rival noble families. We will then look at the importance of his marriage and how this unified the two warring houses of Lancaster and York. Finally, we will examine how Henry used the Tudor rose as an emblem to promote the Tudor dynasty and unification of the two warring houses. Henry won a great but surprising victory at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August, 1485. However, his main support base was in his father's homeland of Wales, and he was a faceless player in the War of the Roses because he had spent most of his life in exile. During that time he had been in Brittany, where he had built up a network of Lancastrians and defecting Yorkists, along with a spy network that informed him of events in England. However, this was a very small circle of influence and trust, so he would need to take careful steps to both acquire and remain on the throne. The first action he took was quite bold. He backdated his reign to the 21st of August so to declare Richard III a usurper and all those who fought against him at Bosworth as traitors to the realm. This was a brave move because his right to the throne was one of conquest, and objectively speaking, he was the usurper, regardless of whether Richard killed his nephews. The second action that Henry took was to arrest key Yorkists. Elizabeth of York was the eldest daughter of Edward IV and so the de facto heiress to the House of York. Her cousin, the Earl of Warwick, was the closest male heir to the Yorkist claim, but he was only 10 years old. They were placed under house arrest so that they could not escape to the continent and act as a figurehead to a Yorkist counter-coup. Henry then awarded those who had loyally followed him into battle. He bestowed 11 knighthoods in total. This was important because it was a show of gratitude for their bravery in supporting him as the underdog. It also elevated their status and so helped to prepare the royal court for a change in the power play of court politics. Just over 2 months after his victory at Bosworth, Henry was crowned in Westminster Abbey. This was a significant event since the coronation ceremony bestows the divine right to rule upon the king. It was the first major step toward legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects and other European rulers. Henry waited until a week after his coronation to call his first parliament on the 7th of November. This way, he could claim his legitimacy was divinely ordained rather than bestowed upon him by his people's representatives of Parliament. However, his ability to call Parliament without any significant resistance from either the House of Lords or the House of Commons was another way of boosting his legitimacy as King of England. Finally, he married Elizabeth of York on the 18th of January. While still in exile, Henry had negotiated this marriage agreement with defected Yorkists using his spy network. However, after Bosworth, he was slow to acknowledge this agreement. Instead, he wished to show England that he could rule as the king in his own right, rather than effectively acting as the consort to the rightful queen. He achieved this by successfully calling his first parliament. At this point, he felt it was important to see through this promise, so to unify the two houses. Let's look at Henry's first parliament, which opened on the 7th of November. Parliament played a less significant role in late medieval politics than it does today, with the King's Court taking a much more prominent role. Nonetheless, it was an important mechanism of government that could be used to legislate acts. During Henry's first parliament, the MPs granted him the right to tonnage and poundage. This is a customs duty tax on exports and imports. It was customary for Parliament to grant the right to collect this tax to the king during the first parliament of a king's reign. By doing so, Parliament were now acknowledging Henry as the legitimate king of England. Henry's main priority for his first parliament was to curb the power of powerful nobles who supported Richard at Bosworth. To do this, he used an act of attainder. He attainted Richard himself, declaring him a usurper. This then justified the use of the attainder against his key supporters. In total, he passed the Act of Attainder against 28 Yorkists. These Yorkists were then stripped of their titles and lands. This was a clever move because it disempowered the nobles, whilst if Henry had ordered their execution, he would have appeared like a bloodthirsty king. Most notably, he attainted Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, who was one of Richard III's closest supporters. Surrey's father, John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, died at Bosworth fighting for Richard. Therefore, this act of attainder was important, to avoid the son trying to avenge the death of the father. After the attainder was passed, Surrey was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Two other notable Yorkists to receive this act of attainder were Viscount Lovell and Humphrey Stafford. However, Henry could not arrest them because they had sought sanctuary in Colchester Abbey. Anybody can go to an abbey and plead sanctuary from persecution, and by doing so, the church will protect them from the laws of the king. In early 1486, Henry passed another important law through Parliament. This is called the Act of Resumption. This reclaimed the Crown lands that had been given away as part of the Wars of the Roses. One way to think about this is that Henry resumed the borders of Henry VI, the last Lancastrian king, as part of the Act of Resumption. This was an important action for two reasons. Firstly, it confiscated land from noblemen who had gained power and influence under Edward IV or Richard III. Secondly, the Crown lands would provide long-term revenue in order to boost Henry's finance. Finally, in 1487, Henry used Parliament to pass the first Act of Retainer. This was a law that made it illegal for nobles to own private armies. Private armies were defined as any men who wore the livery or emblem of a noble and swore service to them. This act is often confused with the Act of Attainder because they sound similar. The Act of Retainer was used to prevent nobles from building up their own private armies. The word retainer links to a nobleman's right to retain men. This is a feudal right that goes back to the days of William the Conqueror, who bestowed upon his barons the right to retain men as knights, who could then be called upon to put down rebellions. However, during the War of the Roses, the feudal system was turned on its head. Victorian historians coined the phrase bastard feudalism to describe when an overmighty nobleman is able to depose a king. This happened to both Richard II and Henry VI during the Middle Ages. Therefore, the Act of Retainer was incredibly important to prevent history repeating itself for a third time. By preventing nobles from keeping men under their own livery, and thus, no man in England should have divided loyalties between their king and their noble lord. The third significant move that Henry made was a personal one. He kept to his promise to marry Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. This was arguably the most significant decision he made in the early months of his reign, since it united the two houses. Polydore Virgil, writing during the reign of Henry VIII, claimed it was the two mother-in-laws who agreed upon the match. In 1583, after Richard had stolen the throne from Elizabeth's younger brother Edward V, her mother Elizabeth Woodville apparently met with Margaret Beaufort and secretly agreed to support Henry's claim to the throne. But if he was successful, Henry must marry her eldest daughter. Regardless of who was behind it, Henry VII swore an oath that he would marry Elizabeth of York in the Cathedral of Rennes in Brittany. However, a rumor circulated court in 1485 that Richard himself intended to marry Elizabeth of York, following the death of his own wife, despite being her uncle. We will never know whether there was truth behind this rumor because Henry invaded before Richard could act on it. By the time of her wedding in January 1486, Elizabeth was 20 years old, and the eldest of 5 living daughters by Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. Therefore, in order to secure her legitimacy as the queen consort, she had to produce a male heir. This she did with impeccable timing, only 9 months after their wedding. In September 1486, Henry chose the name Arthur for his eldest son, the name of the legendary ancient king of England, rather than continuing with the Lancastrian tradition of naming the eldest son Henry. A cruel irony, perhaps, given that it would be the second son who would succeed their father and become the formidable Henry VIII. But that is a discussion for a later lecture. However, in these crucial early years, the birth of a healthy male heir was vital to Henry's consolidation of power. It now meant that any Yorkists who rebelled against Henry VII were also rebelling against the de facto heir to the House of York. The marriage of Elizabeth of York to Henry Tudor unified the two warring houses. The Tudor rose became the emblem of this unification, with the white York rose encased in the red Lancastrian rose. Henry was then able to use this in propaganda to boost the legitimacy of the Tudor reign. The emblem was sewn onto official tapestries and displayed when the king was on progress around the country. It was carved onto stone on the entranceway of royal buildings and churches. It was minted onto coins, and it was ultimately picked up by the later Tudor monarchs as a symbol of the dynasty's power. Here, you can see the replica of Arthur's famous Round Table, which is believed to have been made in the Middle Ages. The rose in the center was originally painted gold, but Henry VII had it repainted as the Tudor rose. You can see how this, alongside his decision to name his eldest son Arthur, was part of a sophisticated propaganda tactic to show the people of England that the Tudor dynasty will bring strength, peace and prosperity. The emblem of the Tudor rose has become such a great success that it is sometimes known simply as the English rose. It has been used on coins, for the English rugby team, and even a fish and chips van. I mean, is there anything more English than a fish and chips van called the Tudor rose? Let's now return to our overarching question of, how did Henry VII consolidate his position in the first 2 years of his reign? Firstly, consider his first steps to ensure continued loyalty from those who fought with him at the Battle of Bosworth and punishment for those who fought against him. Then consider how he used Parliament in the first 2 years to bolster the legitimacy of his reign and curb the power of the nobility, especially through the Act of Attainder. Then it is important to discuss Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York and how they were able to quickly produce a male heir, who they called Arthur. This united the houses and further secured Henry's position. This union was then immortalized through the symbol of the Tudor rose. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next lecture to examine how Henry overcame the dynastic threats posed by Yorkist claimants and pretenders.